Good afternoon. Welcome to our show. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. It should come as no surprise to anyone that there are women on wherever there are women on lonely roadways, there could be predators. Authorities and researchers on both sides of the border point out that women, and disproportionately Indigenous women, go missing or turn up dead on these highways. And the FBI has even gone as far as to single out one industry in particular, saying that the trucking profession is, quote, convenient for aspiring serial killers to pick up unsuspecting victims and discard them along the road in another state miles away. Knowing that, in 2009, the FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings Initiative to raise awareness among law enforcement agencies across state borders. According to the FBI's website, the victims in these cases are primarily women who are living high-risk transient lifestyles, often involving substance abuse and prostitution. They're frequently picked up at truck stops or service stations, sexually assaulted, murdered, and dumped along a highway. The FBI says the suspects are predominantly long-haul truck drivers, but the mobile nature of the offenders and the unsafe lifestyle of some victims and the significant different distances and jurisdictions that are involved in the lack of witnesses or forensic evidence can make these cases very tough to solve. The good news is that some in the trucking industry are making this their very own concern. In the U.S., Truckers Against Trafficking was started to raise awareness among them to be on the lookout for predators in their midst. Researchers say that these killers operate in Canada too, which might be disturbing to hear. Including the infamous Highway of Tears, a 724-kilometre stretch of the Yellowhead Highway in sparsely populated northern BC. The RCMP say 18 women have gone missing or been found murdered on this isolated stretch of rugged highway, but many Indigenous organizations peg that number at more than 40 women. And we've got experts who say it's not just that highway, it's much more widespread throughout Canada. Today, we are putting truck route killers in focus. We want you to join in our conversation. Our phone lines are open for our viewers and to our listeners on Element FM radio in Toronto and Ottawa. You can call us toll-free, 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Before I introduce you to our guests, let's go back to when the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls made a stop in Smithers, BC in September 2017. The issue of truckers preying on area women and hitchhikers was raised there. Let's watch.
There are officially 18 cases of women and girls whose deaths and disappearances are part of the RCMP's investigation on the Highway of Tears. Many advocates say the number is closer to 50.
When we decide that we want to report to the RCMP, they never take us seriously. I've heard so many things like when they say, well, maybe she's gone out to party, or she'll be home in a couple of days, or we don't care.
Many families and survivors of the MMIWG inquiry are critical of police. But at the opening of the hearings this week in BC, the RCMP participated in the Tears for Justice March. They even joined in on a round dance. Families here in Smithers say the RCMP do have a role in righting the wrongs committed in the disappearance, murder, and mistreatment of Indigenous women and girls. However, some families do not feel that the RCMP should be physically here at the inquiry.
The families were telling me that when they see the big police blazoned on their chests and they're standing there like this at the door, it made the families feel a little uncomfortable. And I spoke to her and I said, you guys really should be coming in as plain clothes. If you support us, then come in plain clothes. We don't need to know that the police presence is here.
Some witnesses have been questioning RCMP tactics dealing with the murdered and missing.
I phoned the police to try and get information. They didn't give me that much then.
Only hours before the families went to testify, police showed Marlene Jack new information about her sister's death and her cousin, who was shown a coroner's report on a cell phone.
Then all of a sudden, Tuesday when I arrived, they all of a sudden want to sit down and talk to me, right? Why is that? You know, they didn't want to talk to me before. I've tried numerous times to get a hold of them. And I reached out to the RCMP in Prince George also, and they said, oh, we've been looking for you. We lost your contact information.
Wayne Clary of the RCMP investigation team said that families knew that investigators would be at the inquiry ahead of time.
So our job attached to the inquiry was to gather information and tell them about that.
But is it proper to tell them about that the same day that they're testifying?
Well, what I'll say is they asked for us to be here. We spoke to some families this week. We got the request, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and it was arranged that this would be convenient for them.
Gary Kerr, the chief investigator for the case of Alberta Williams, who died on the Highway of Tears, testified that more trust between families and RCMP could have helped solve the case years ago.
We probably could have been more forthcoming as the investigating agency, as the police, as to what we knew. Maybe we should have shared more with the family. But looking back, again, like I've said, a fair amount of information has now come forward, albeit 28 years later, that I really wish we would have had at the time we were doing the initial investigation.
Charlotte Moore-Jacobs, APTN National News, Smithers.
Joining us now in studio is Michael Arntfield. He is a criminologist and a serial killer expert working in Canada and the United States. In 2011, he founded the Cold Case Society at Western University. It uses students and faculty from across multiple disciplines to analyze unsolved crimes and other failed investigations with fresh eyes. So in doing that through the lens of new technology and emerging investigative methodologies. He's also a director of the Murder Accountability Project, which we definitely want to learn more about. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, we want to know, first of all, what is the Murder Accountability Project?
So the Murder Accountability Project, or MAP as we call it, is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. There's 12 of us who are comprised of the board of directors. I'm the only Canadian. Most are either investigative journalists, retired law enforcement, data scientists, or homicide scholars. I tick a few of those boxes.
Homicide scholars.
Yeah, I tick a few of those boxes, and what we do is essentially we are the accountants of murder in America. It's our mandate to tell Americans how they're being murdered, in what numbers, in what groups, disproportionate to other groups, what police departments do the best and worst jobs of solving these murders. And all of our data is publicly accessible and publicly interactive. You can go to the site now, murderdata.org, and you can search by city, you can search by weapon, you can search by ethnic group, you can search by age group, and you can find patterns either as a researcher or as a criminal investigator that will sort of cut through the red tape that we see, for instance, is still keeping a lot of cases in Canada, unfortunately, sort of in the muck.
We know, even before we get into the serial killers or random murderers, we know that Indigenous women are disproportionately the victims of homicide or go missing here in Canada and in the United States. Who typically are the killers?
Well, and this is where I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. Overwhelmingly, offenders who target females, period, regardless of ethnic background or culture, are intimate partners, and this is very well documented, and the vast majority of the time they're caught. So one of the things we do at the Murder Accountability Project, and that informs my own work at the university, is when you see departures from that accepted norm in large numbers, either by city, by county, by a certain group, even on a certain stretch of highway, you have to ask why. And when we catch, the vast majority of the time, an offender who for instance, murders one person, when we see 3 and 4 clustering in space and time and not getting caught, are these all separate intimate partners who just happen to be getting away with it, or are we dealing with someone who is systematically targeting either a type of person or people specific to a certain location and using investigative countermeasures that are allowing them to get away with it? So that's one of the things that we track.
So you study murders in Canada and the United States. Just talking earlier, it's a little bit disturbing, to me anyways, how many serial killers might be out there. Like, what are we talking? Let's just talk about Canada, for example. I would think if you were to ask the average person, how many serial killers do you think are operating in Canada? People might guess 10 or 20, maybe?
Yeah, we tend to use at the Murder Accountability Project the rule in the United States, it's about 8 to 10 times what has been previously estimated. So we conservatively estimate, using our own software that looks at nearly 1 million murders since the late 60s that are still unsolved. We estimate there's about 4,000 active in the United States right now.
4,000?
In the United States. So we know, for instance, the Highway Serial Killing Initiative that you've already discussed has about 400 to 450 offender profiles of unidentified subjects on its database alone that are involved in the trucking industry.
That's down in the United States. Is that for all the interstate highway?
That's for the entire interstate system.
But then, okay.
But bear in mind that based on what we know about serial offenders for the most part is very few of them are that interjurisdictional, are that mobile. Many of them tend to be location specific, not necessarily a single stretch of road or a single neighborhood, but at least a single municipality or county where they know the landmarks, they're familiar with the terrain, they have home field advantage, so to speak. So when we see then that a specific subtype is numbering, and these are conservative Justice Department estimates, right? They would not release this data unless they were relatively certain and had sort of supporting data. So when we see that, it's at almost 500. I mean, that's well beyond already what in previous years was thought to be the total national picture. In Canada, we know even less about them because the data just isn't available. A lot of people have gone to great lengths to make sure that people like us can't get the data in Canada.
What's the purpose of that? I mean, isn't it to everybody's benefit? You would think that there would be political will, police pushing for this, that there would be some sort of tracking so we know what we're dealing with here. Why aren't we seeing that in Canada?
Well, there is a system in theory that's in place called the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System, which is a questionnaire that's completed in every violent crime, including homicide, that then gets uploaded and disappears into a black hole of bureaucracy. And beyond that, we don't know what gets done with that data. We don't know what matches have been made. As far as public record goes, no matches have ever been made. The U.S. has a similar system that we know has failed, and that's where murder accountability came along. And we basically found the blind spots in the data all over the country, departments that weren't submitting the questionnaires, that were submitting half-completed questionnaires, that were just making up answers, and we basically cleaned that out. We've tried to build a similar database in Canada that would allow us very clearly to see and visualized on a screen, coast to coast, who's being targeted and in what numbers and how. And we have faced roadblocks at every turn in this country.
Who's throwing up the roadblocks?
Well, unlike in the United States, murder data in Canada, so in the United States, Justice Department, the FBI, collects, administers, and studies homicide data. And they also make it publicly available upon request, with some limitations, obviously. They hold back case-specific information, but we also get a lot of good information about weapon, motive, stuff that will allow us then to feed a computer program to then look for these patterns. In Canada, the thought is, because this data is owned by StatsCan, so if we wanted the same information, which of course every year releases its report on trends in homicide in Canada, and you can go to the StatsCan website and get all this. So they decide, rather than the experts in this country, who should know what, and essentially control the narrative on homicide. The thought being that if that were ever to be made public and searchable the way it is in the United States at murderdata.org, that it would be violating the privacy interests of the murder victims, and by extension, maybe the offenders. So we tried a backdoor route, and we went police department to police department, filing separate freedom of information requests. And you can imagine how long this is going to take.
Yeah.
And
we file a lot of freedom of information requests around here, and
right. So even when you go for the big fish that control a lot of municipalities, and you can get some good data. So the OPP in Ontario, the QPF or Sûreté in Quebec, and then the RCMP, who of course have contract policing assignments all over the country, with the exception of Ontario and Quebec. You would think, you know, here's a great opportunity to get most of the information that, you know, StatsCan can't provide actually by law. So under the Statistics Act. So we, of course, had no consistency in that respect. We got numbers coming back saying this is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, basically just to pull the paperwork. The paperwork doesn't exist. It's gone missing. We can't release information on active and ongoing investigations. And we're talking cases back to the 80s that have not seen an interview or a lead followed up in 30 years, but under the pretext of them being active and ongoing, that allows them to not have to release any of the information. So there's I can tell you one police department in Ontario complied. I'm not going to advertise who it is because that will lead to some probably wrangling.
Right.
But by their compliance, I think it was about $20, and we got 40 years worth of data, including causes of death, how many killers were caught, information we could use to identify potential serial patterns. And it cost, I think, $20. And we were getting quotes from similar-sized departments, so this is $25,000 or more. So they tried to price us out. I mean,
wow.
In the United States, we're a registered nonprofit, and then in Canada, obviously, my work through the university is a public institution that isn't flush with cash at any given time.
You've said that there are fewer murders solved today than 45 years ago. I think that's something, it shocked me. I think a lot of people think that police are doing a better job in general of solving murders, with the exception of Indigenous women who are murdered. I think people look and say the solve rate is less on those because police don't care. Does the data support that notion? The
data is all over the place. We know in Canada it's not as bad as the U.S. 2016 marked a new low in Canada for overall what we call clearance rates, which is the sort of the baseline solvability of homicide. In the U.S. that same year, so something happened in 2016 in both countries that basically saw us plumbing the bottoms of how well we could do. So in the United States, 2016 marked the lowest year in recorded history using the current cataloging system called the Uniform Crime Report System. That was the lowest, and that's been in place since the late 1920s. 2016 marked the lowest per capita solved rate in history, meaning per total number of people murdered, more killers were getting away, and it was about 1 in 2 nationally. So for every person murdered and the suspect identified and arrested, there was another one. And we're not talking arrested and acquitted.
Right.
We're talking never even identified, out there walking around.
Is it because the killers are getting better, or is it because the policing's getting worse, or is it a combination?
I think it's a combination. So there's 3 prevailing hypotheses as to why this is happening. Number one is the way society is gone, and just how individualistic and sort of compartmentalized people are. That is the end of the community, and we have more people killing random people, and more people being less willing to cooperate in investigations. So we have more stranger-on-stranger killings, or fewer cooperative witnesses, to the point where we're left with no usual suspects sort of within that first critical 48-hour window. The second thought is that killers are getting a bit better, that they're deploying what we call countermeasures. They've watched TV, they know how to sort of create doubt, create 2 separate crime scenes, move a body, introduce staging. I mean, we saw this, for instance, in the murders of the Sherman couple in Toronto. Elaborate staging at the scene that had fooled even veteran homicide detectives in Toronto who thought it was a murder-suicide. And then it was a double suicide. Well, in fact, it was a double murder. And a host of cases like that. And the third is actually probably the most frightening, which is that, and we're already seeing this in specific cities that have sort of dropped off a cliff in terms of their ability to consistently solve murder. And these are the same cities that have, over the last few years, been consistently relaxing their recruiting standards because they're desperate for people. Police investigative work, in spite of what you see on TV, is not a sought-after profession anymore, certainly not in this country. So major organizations have had to relax their standards to, I would say, alarming levels, to the point that some agencies, and again, I'm not going to advertise them, no credit check, no physical test, no written test. Essentially, people who would have been screened out immediately as recently as 5 years ago from even being considered are now getting in. And 2 to 3 years in, they're now ending up in specialty units like homicide. And that's where we see in these certain cities, and again, I'm not going to advertise them. But
it's not one city, though. You're seeing this in multiple jurisdictions.
And we see this especially in the United States. I mean, some cities have solved rates.
Canada, too? Are we seeing it here?
Around 20-30%, which means 7 of 10 killers are getting away with it. So where are we going to be in 5 years amid everything going on? So there's no single answer. There's I think it's a systemic issue. It has to do with police recruiting and retention, morale, has to do with funding and training. I was mentioning before the show.
Yeah, I want to get into the training, the lack of training. We have to take a break, though, right now, but when we come back, I want to get into that, the training element of that, and what's not being done. Okay, so when we come back, there's recently a chilling attempted abduction allegedly involving a trucker in British Columbia. And we'll also have more disturbing information about serial killers that might shock you. That's coming up after the break. Stay with us. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Welcome back. Let's go to social media now to hear what some of you are saying about today's topic. We asked in a poll, do you believe that serial killers are traveling North American highways and are responsible for at least some missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? As of showtime, we had over 1,000 votes. 92% of you said, yes, you believe that's the case. 8% of you say, no, you don't think so. Let's check out some of the comments that we had. Joseph James says, over 500 bodies were found along interstates, and the link was made to truck drivers. It is too easy to find prey, unwary. Ted Bundy would put his arm in a sling. Glenna says, I've heard that a lot of people are abducted, transported to the St. Lawrence River, and ferried out of country, and their loved ones' lives are changed forever. That's another thing that we've heard a few times, too, about the, on ships, people being trafficked, yeah. Rod says, we can all play CSI, but the bottom line over all these years is that Aboriginal women are targeted because almost no one in law enforcement really cares when they go missing and when they're found dead. It's changing, but too slow, and it leaves a scar on all of us. Mary says, I believe they are not serial killers, but people from all walks of life. They're taxi drivers, semi-drivers, police, people of minority, and the list goes on, as well as serial killers, but not just serial killers. And Leslie says that killings for body parts, you never know until you really explore all possibilities. You can still vote on our poll on the APTN National News Facebook page. If you'd like to add your opinion to our topic of conversation, here's how you can do that. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. I want to talk to you. We've got Michael Arntfield, who's joining us here. He's a criminologist, serial killer expert. We're talking about truck route killings in part, serial killers in part. Let's talk about police training there's the question, can you prevent serial killers? And I guess it would start with police training, and you've got some disturbing information about the lack of police training on this front.
Well, we know, and this is very well documented, unlike what I think people think they know or they read about or see on TV or in film, serial offenders don't just wake up one day and decide to do this. The vast majority of serial murder is sexually motivated, which is why it aligns frequently with sex trade workers. And in fact, there is a subtype of offender who targets only sex trade workers, and it's not because of their availability. It has to do with the whole ideology surrounding that excites them. And there's about 500 of these disorders. They're called paraphilias, and they represent unusual and often violent erotic attachments to specific people, places, things, objects, experiences, sounds, even sights. Some are harmless and weird. Some we know are very dangerous and can escalate predictably. So what I do often as I travel around Canada and the US, I just spoke to about 200 sex crimes investigators in Ontario, and I'm headed out to Alberta next, is how to recognize these precursors, these warning signs during day-to-day interactions with offenders. And now that the term human trafficking is being accepted and acknowledged that this is a major systemic social issue and that persons at risk often, their first career choice is not to do this, and in fact there's deeper seated socioeconomic issues behind this. So let's look at who's exploiting them. So governments have been freeing up money for dedicated human trafficking task forces in all provinces and even in the US. And the moral of the story here is, and I remind investigators of this, is here finally we have dedicated units who the vast majority of their interactions are going to be with frontline purveyors of the sex trade. So either people trafficking or prostituting sex trade workers themselves, or their clients. And when you look historically at some of the worst serial killers on record, their first and only police contact has been during the course of a vice sting or a street-level encounter with a police officer related to using a sex trade worker. So, and the police missed an opportunity in every one of those cases. In some of these cases, Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, Bruce MacArthur in Ontario recently, they had already started murdering, and they were still doing this on the side, and the sort of telltale clues about what their paraphilias were, and we now know there are some that are very high risk.
And
went
noticeable if you know what you're looking for.
If you know what you're looking for. So, I mean, I'll go to these training sessions and I'll say, who's heard of this tumor? Who's heard of this disorder? And these are people monitoring sex offenders or working in vice, and they haven't even heard of them. So the training isn't there to equip frontline investigators with what to look for. And when they do see it, it could be as simple as just flagging someone for increased monitoring, or if they're seen back at this location again, taking more definitive action. And not cutting them breaks. I mean, we know again that the escalation follows in many cases a predictive pattern. So someone who is abusing or assaults a sex trade worker 1 week and is then maybe also, and they're not just doing that. This may be someone who a year prior to that was going to parks and exposing themselves or peeping in windows. These are all well documented preparatory or precursor behaviors that just keep escalating.
And people aren't necessarily making the link between this guy, we thought he was just a simple park pervert who was exposing himself a couple of times over the course of 2 years, but that might be the making of a serial killer that you're not paying attention to in connection with something that's happening now
the
or
law
in the future.
is always 30 to 40 years behind the forensic literature. I mean, it was not until about 2012 that in Canada peeping in windows became an arrestable offense unless you were caught in the act. And now we understand, I mean, so many offenders started with, and this is what voyeurism is. And now people tend to do it electronically and with concealed devices.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can remember being a young police officer, and someone would be walking down the street who met the description of someone who was just peeping in the window of an 8-year-old girl, and unless he was caught on the property actually doing it, he couldn't be arrested. We could get his name and investigate further. But I mean, that's how behind the times in recognizing the threat that these people pose and how they escalate exponentially when unrecognized. And the law's gone easy on these people, and now they're out there, is what's happened.
I wanted to ask you, so what got you interested specifically well, there's two things I want to ask. You can pick which one you want to answer first. So I'm very interested in commuter killers, and I'm very interested in, long-haul truckers as serial killers. Because there's anecdotal evidence that would suggest that both would be responsible for some of our missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Well, it's not just anecdotal. There's
actual.
There's good data going back to the 90s about the preferred occupations of serial killers, or at least the recurring occupations of serial killers, and they're broken down into categories of skill level. And truck driver, I mean, as recently or as far ago as the early 90s, was recognized and still is as, and these are confirmed cases, the third most prevalent occupation among what we call semi-skilled serial killers. So the only ones ahead in that category are actually a arborist or a forestry worker and a warehouse manager, followed by lesser known, random seemingly jobs. But it just happens when we look at known offenders, hundreds of them, there are certain recurring careers that they have, and the question is why. So I've always been interested in the link between occupation and crime, and how certain jobs offer opportunity to motivated offenders. And it need not necessarily just be serial murder, but I mean everything from embezzlement and fraud through to using whether it's not necessarily long-haul trucking, but even just being a traveling salesman on the road, how the pretext of lawful employment allows you to be that stranger using the highways, frequenting places that we call crime attractors. So two types of locations, crime generators and crime attractors. A crime attractor is where a motivated offender can know they can travel to find what they're looking for. And in many cases, that's people, it's vulnerable people. So that would include, and that's not surprisingly why you see what we call known vice areas, so areas of cities where prostitution and the drug trade is rampant, as well as rest stops and truck stops, especially in the U.S. where, I mean, I lived in Tennessee for a year, and there's quote-unquote truck stops there that it's not like you would see here in Canada. They're not properly lit. There's no known franchises there. I mean, if you were to pull off there, there'd only be a handful of reasons why at night you'd be in such a place.
There's spots. Okay, I want to go to a video first, and then we're going to come back. We still have to talk about commuter killers and whatnot. But, okay, so we have a video here. This is from, it was taken earlier this week by a woman who was approached by a trucker. It was widely circulated on social media. The video has been viewed more than 340,000 times and shows a truck driver telling a woman, "I will grab you, I will drive you," in an apparent abduction attempt. Let's watch.
Nothing. Nothing. Stop! What are you doing? Are you kidding me right now? I'm filming you.
According to the Vancouver province, that woman began filming the interaction with her phone when the driver left, but then he allegedly came back, pushed her to the ground, stole the phone, but she had already posted it to social media. The RCMP in Surrey told the province that they're aware of the video, but they wouldn't say if they're investigating the incident or the trucking company whose logo actually appears on the truck. So I want to know, you watch a video like that, is there a lot of people, would you think, out there like this, or are these guys just looking for some other something? Like, does that disturb you? A lot of people were commenting, "Oh my God, I can't believe this woman escaped with her life." You're maybe a little hardened to this thing than the rest of us.
Well, no, it's very disturbing, obviously, and I mean, how many of those cases go on every week, and we'll never know about them because they're not filmed, and that person goes missing and no one goes looking for them. This is what we call the missing in this country. People who are missing and no one's looking for them, and no one knows they're gone except for whoever took them. And by then it's weeks or months or even years later, and remains are discovered, and then you're trying to match remains to missing persons reports, except there is none. So the problem just continues. So, I mean, that's one of the more brazen videos I've seen. There's a recognized set of ways that offenders typically get a victim into a car or control a victim. So the vast majority of commuter killers use what's actually called a ruse-con-based approach, and this is recognized actually in criminal analysis or profiling. So some type of story or lure to get them in the car, either of a ride or drugs or money or what have you. What we see there is what's commonly known as a blitz approach. So someone actually, we would associate this more with, say, a stationary or a place-specific offender, like someone who targeted a park and would lay in wait and jump on someone on a path and then try to overpower them or just use the element of surprise. So here we see actually someone who's highly mobile using a more traditional blitz-based approach we see more affiliated with stationary offenders. So that to me is concerning in that this person seems to be, based on what we know about these people, almost double dipping, and that they have the commuter-based job and they have the access. They're the strangers sort of passing through town and have access to these places, but they're also prepared to revert to, I would say, more primal offender-victim contact techniques. So if this person's ever identified, I mean, the first step I would take is see where they're from. I mean, regardless of where this took place, see where they're from. And I'd be looking at open cases involving not necessarily murders, but attacks on people from areas of concealment that involve that type of blitz ambush. And that term blitz is again recognized in the forensic literature.
Something that had come up often on our social media was people there's a lot of people who seem to link or suspect cab drivers are responsible for our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Does that jive with something with the research that you've done on murders?
So we don't really know for sure. So let's break it down.
And you don't want to just carte blanche paint a profession, but
paint a certain profession.
People are saying that they think that there is a link. In a lot of places like Winnipeg, Edmonton, Saskatoon, places where there's a lot of people that go missing and murdered, people have drawn that comparison.
The difference is, again, so I should specify, in terms of, there's an area of criminology we call psychogeography. This is a newer term, which deals with the psychology of geography and space, and how offenders make decisions about what to do with their victims once they're on board, and where to even go to look for them. In a built environment like a city, a serial predator is going to behave much differently than they do in a rural area or on an open highway. So we can break those down into two blanket categories: commuter killers or commuter offenders, and marauder offenders. So someone who sort of stays to a territory and lurks around that territory sort of randomly, knows the terrain, and acts often opportunistically. So I think we need to be careful to not lump together jobs that involve just driving, in that they're fundamentally different psychological profiles. Someone who travels 4,500 miles in a week in a tractor trailer is going to go through a much more different organizational and preparatory process than someone who works a beat as a cab driver, as a cop, as just about, as a delivery person. I mean, mobility and offending, we now know, go hand in hand. I mean, the invention, I don't want to get too technical here, but certainly the mass production of the automobile changed crime forever, and I've written about that and published about that extensively. You see new types of crime, everything from interstate kidnapping to armed robbery, because now you have a getaway car. New breeds of crime pop up, including serial murder. So I think we need to be careful to just say, well, because someone's driving, they're a motivated serial killer. Well, again, you could drive a cab in a city, your psychological makeup and your choice to gravitate maybe to that as a pretext to have access to victims is going to be very, very different from someone who gravitates to long-haul trucking. One is actually pretty social, one is very solitary, one is fairly confined, one is, extremely random. And so there's far better data on commuter killers than specific, I would say, vehicle-related jobs for more marauder-style offenders.
How many people, or is this common that you would have just a guy who has the opportunity and kills somebody kind of out of a thrill, and that they never do it again?
No, very rare. Okay. So, and this is why, U.S. Code Section 540B, I believe, Title 28, describes or defines serial murder for the purposes of involving the FBI. So basically classifying as a federal offense, technically, that could bring in the whole might of the U.S. government, defines it as 3 or more victims. That came around in 1998. By 2006, homicide scholars and criminologists met and said, why are we waiting for 3? By 1, you often know, and certainly by 2, once you have 2 separate victims in separate incidents at separate locations, it's clear that a pattern is emerging. This is something that someone takes great pleasure in, that this is not a one-off thing for a personal reason, revenge, profit, what have you, that the more random it is, or seemingly random, the more likely it is actually to reflect, again, these deep-seated paraphilias. There is something expressive and rewarding to the offender to do that, like a sex act or like something else that gives them pleasure, they're not just going to stop after once. It's going to become repetitive and then eventually becomes compulsive. And that's where they begin, fortunately, in most cases, we'd like to believe, to begin making mistakes.
Is there in Canada, do you believe that there is a hotbed of where serial killers are operating in Canada?
Well, we've got a solid interactive map of the U.S. that is really unquestionable. We see them both coasts. So we know, for instance, there's already been very good research on the role of the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest generally, in both the U.S. and in Canada, which helps explain a lot of patterns that are seen in lower mainland BC and in the Highway of Tears region, even into the northern interior, you don't see anywhere else. So that's already been well established, and we see that when we input all the data at murderdata.org, and we see both coasts light up. We see the DC metro region and sort of the Great Lakes region light up. And we see major trucking centers light up, specifically places that otherwise don't have a lot of violent crime. So the Nashville to Oklahoma City corridor is, I mean, where a lot of major trucking operations are based, and you see that really light up. Again, we don't know for sure in Canada because no one will give us the data. No one will share the data. But my guess is you're going to see, for sure, the West Coast. You'll see Edmonton up to Fort Mac, where that's already well established. Will you see the East Coast represented as much as in the U.S.? My guess is not. But certainly Manitoba through to Northern Ontario, down through the Golden Horseshoe into the Greater Toronto area as well.
Okay, we got to take another break. When we come back, we've got a new link to an old serial killer. An Indigenous woman from Canada recognizes her photograph among others collected by a man dubbed the truck stop killer. APTN Investigates producer Holly Moore broke that story, and she's going to join us to share it. Stay with us. Welcome back. Holly Moore joins us now. She's the producer at APTN Investigates and recently broke a story about a Thunderchild First Nation woman made a chilling discovery online that could help police in 2 countries discover more about a convicted serial killer's activities. Holly, this case relates to Robert Ben Rhodes, aka the truck stop killer. In February, you spoke with a woman who is believed to have been one of the ones that got away. How did this story come on your radar?
Well, I'm, of course, a part of a number of missing and murdered Indigenous women's groups, and she posted a picture that said, "This is me." So it was a really famous picture that had been circulating of an Indigenous woman that had been found amongst Robert Ben Rhodes's possessions. So along with the picture...
We're seeing our viewers can see it right now.
Yeah, along with a very famous picture of Regina Walters, who he was eventually charged and convicted of. This was on the same roll of film.
This woman who we're seeing, the Thunderchild's
First Nation woman,
is on the same roll of film as the woman who we're seeing now, who is victim Regina Walters.
Yeah.
And this particular serial killer used to find women hitchhikers, would put them in his truck. He had like a torture chamber in his truck, I do believe.
That wasn't until later, actually. So
he graduated to that.
Yeah, he graduated to that.
But he would take pictures of women like this, so he would cut their hair, dress them up. This was his kind of thing.
That was his MO. So, so of course, the woman who said, "This is me, who do I contact to say I'm okay?" So, of course, the first thing I did was verify that indeed somebody had a picture that kind of matched up with that picture. It was around the same time that she had been hitchhiking just outside of Edmonton. She relayed a chilling story of how he picked her up, dropped her off just in Winnipeg, Manitoba, so right here. He picked her up around White Star, Saskatchewan. And she said that she knew that that everybody had to pay. There was an ass, grass, or cash, motto back then, and so they had consensual sex, and he let her go. She identified Robert Ben Rhodes as the man who was driving the truck that picked her up.
Does she know? I mean, when you know that this guy is a serial killer, when you were talking to her, did you ask her? Looking back, how do you think you got away? Well, then I'm going to ask you: is there criteria where you would get away? Like, how do they know? How do they decide which one you kill and which one can go on their merry way? So did she
of course, Vanessa Velselka, who I had to, number one, trace the photo back to where it first came from. It came from a GQ article where Mark Young had given this photo to the author Vanessa Velselka,
Mark Young being
a FBI agent. So Vanessa actually got away as well. And so she asked herself those questions. Why did I get away? Why did he pull a hunting knife on me and then let me go? It's an unanswerable thing. In Pamela's case, she believes that because she was nice, because she didn't put up a fight for the sex, because she was not exhibiting some of the same fear that Rhodes definitely was getting off on, he allowed her to go.
You're not saying that makes sense to you. So is there... I mean, you think that if it's a serial killer, you kill everybody you can possibly get your hands on. Is that necessarily the case?
That's frequently the case. And again, there's no predictive model that we can develop to say, if you do this, you'll be spared. I mean, the reality is they act unpredictably, but frequently, and this shows up in a few cases where, and this sounds absolutely mind-boggling and terrifying to think about, but again, I mentioned the paraphilias earlier, and that most, if not all, serial homicide is sexually motivated. So if, yes, this is someone who places great arousal value on terrorizing somebody, and if the person does not respond accordingly, there's a saying that every crime begins and ends with a decision made by a victim, and they may not know if they're making the right one or the wrong one, but offenders are typically responding to what the victim does. So if, and there'd be no way of knowing this, but if the victim's behavior is such that it's clear that this is not going to go the way and meet the fantasy of the killer, they may, one of two things can happen. They can abort the whole process, and they often, yes, do get away, or they will just modify their MO and kill them differently and just deem it sort of a lost leader, if you want to think about it that way.
That's just disturbing to think about.
Well, this is the reality of what you don't see on Criminal Minds. I mean, the reality is it's not a sort of prescribed system. It's a world where you need to sort of abandon, I think, any thought that, I mean, the majority of people wouldn't be capable of this. And fortunately, it seems most people aren't, but there is a large segment of people out there.
Bigger chunk than you would think. Yeah.
And that's why there's 500 of these disorders. And again, not all of them manifest themselves in violent predatory conduct.
Yeah, you said they could be from weird to...
Yeah, but the seedlings are there in a number of people, and then we now know that a number of factors can put them off course, and that this is how they graduate, as you mentioned, to more violent behavior.
I have to ask you, if we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, your thoughts on the national inquiry. I mean, you're a criminologist, you are an expert in this sort of thing. When you heard that there's going to be a national inquiry, what were your thoughts? And then as you watched it, it's wrapped up now, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, let me stress this. The tools are out there, that if they were serious about getting to the bottom of this, and when I say tools, I mean a body of expertise in this country, technological tools, including the stuff that we use at Murder Accountability. I guess I wanted to know, what were the deliverables? What was the outcome intended of this? Was this an exercise in storytelling and in catharsis, which is valuable, but I was thinking more like you'd see in the U.S. of congressional hearings, where there needs to be changes in legislation and policy that comes from it. And I'll tell you this, while this was going on in Canada, my colleagues and I at Murder Accountability conducted a study in the United States where this is also a problem. It's not discussed as readily as it is in Canada. And the evidence, again, we always use what goes on in the U.S. as sort of a barometer for what may be going on here and not talked about here. And it actually seems to be an even bigger problem than we knew about. Yeah. So what we found is only about half, coast to coast in the United States, half of all homicides of First Nations victims are properly reported as homicides. The rest go missing and are miscategorized as either accidental deaths or suicides, which squares with some of the stories that we heard about during the inquiry, where they were just sort of written off as runaways, and then maybe they're found later on and oh, this must have been death by misadventure or something like that. What people don't know is in the United States, all deaths get investigated by the Centers for Disease Control and medical people there, and they rule them frequently homicides where police made bad calls. So we're seeing...
We don't have that here.
50%, there's not the same quality control, so we're seeing 50% of cases written off or just not reported to the Justice Department as murders are actually murders. So if that's true, we're just scratching the surface on this problem.
We had a similar situation in Canada as well. Like, they're called no foul play cases, and we did a project that looked at cases of suicide and accidental death, and where there was ample evidence that there was either a domestic partner involved, there were bruises in the autopsy photo. I mean, the family believed that the woman was killed, and there was no second look at those cases. Yeah. And we really hoped that with the inquiry that it would get to the root causes.
There's been none of the addressing of the root causes. Yeah. You know, there's no who's doing this, why are they doing, why are Indigenous women dying, who is killing them, where, there's none of that. So when you get the reports, We've got like 30 seconds. The report comes out next month. What do you anticipate to see in it that's useful?
Very little that's useful. And in fact, very quickly, the more actionable information is probably going to come out of Ontario, where the chief coroner has said that the similar no foul play presumption has lost a lot of murders, and a real inquest is going on there.
Well, we're all out of time. Thanks for joining us today. We will see you back here next week. Thanks to Michael. Thanks to Holly so much for joining us. Fascinating conversation.